סגן נשיא ארצות הברית בשעתו, דניס רוס, שר הביטחון בני גנץ, חבר הכנסת יולי אדלשטיין ואנשים נוספים. Senator Lieberman, good morning and thank you for your time and for joining us.
Good morning, Shad. Good to be with you again.
How do you find Israel? This is not your first visit here.
Well, it's always good to be in Israel, and I really mean that. We have a lot of family here, but to me, the country seems at a very good stage of its history. There are obviously threats, and the one that I worry about most, of course, for Israel and for America is the Islamic Republic of Iran. But inside the country, a lot of wonderful economic activity, even some political progress. So, kol tov.
So you have said Iran, so let's continue with this. The nuclear agreement in Vienna concerns Israel a great deal, and it sheds a mysterious light about America's interest and America's policy regarding this. How do you see America's policy regarding this agreement?
Well, yeah. So the policy of the Biden administration, which really follows closely on the policy of the Obama administration, seems to be to do almost whatever is possible to achieve a temporary agreement in which the Iranians don't stop their nuclear development program, but push the pause button. And I can tell you, because I worked hard for most of my 24 years in the U.S. Senate with members of both political parties, that members of Congress adopted all those economic sanctions on Iran because we wanted Iran to stop its nuclear program, not to pause it. So I thought that the 2015 Iran nuclear agreement under Obama was a terrible mistake. It didn't stop the nuclear program. It gave them money, the Iranians, that they gave mostly to their terrorist proxies like Hezbollah, Hamas, etc.
And I think
seems going to repeat it again.
Yes.
Pardon.
And this agreement seems to be even worse than Obama's administration agreement.
Say that again, Shai, sorry.
I said that this agreement seems even worse than the one that Obama put his hands on.
Yeah, well, right, we don't know exactly, but from everything we hear coming from the negotiating table in Vienna, I think it will be worse than the one that Obama negotiated. Again, apparently they're not going to extend the so-called sunsets deadline. So this agreement, 2 or 3 years from now, the Iranians will start to do things that the agreement was meant to stop them from doing. Again, it gives them money. And really shockingly, the Iranians appear to be successfully negotiating for removing sanctions from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is a terrorist group that's killed Israelis, Arabs, and Americans. So I just think the better tactic would be for America to leave the negotiating table, actually impose more economic pressure on Iran, not less, and hope that Iran comes to the table to negotiate a real agreement to stop the nuclear weapons program. Otherwise, I think we have to do what we did during the Cold War and support the resistance groups within Iran to that bad government, just as we're supporting the Ukrainian resistance against the Russian invasion now.
Let me just translate for a second to our Hebrew speakers. אומר הסנטור ליברמן, ההסכם שאובמה ב-2015 בירך את ידיו עליו היה הסכם גרוע, עושה רושם שההסכם הזה שאנחנו עומדים בפניו גם הוא הסכם לא טוב, הוא יסיר את הסנקציות מעל האיראנים, יחליש את בעלות בריתה של ארצות הברית. אני חושב שהוא רעיון רע מאוד. על ארצות הברית הוא טוען במידה וההסכם הזה, זאת אומרת, על ארצות הברית לדעתו להשעות את החתימה על ההסכם הזה ולנסות לתמוך בגורמי אופוזיציה פנימיים בתוך איראן כדי לנסות ולהפוך להפיל את המשטר האסלאמי הרדיקלי הזה. סנטור ליברמן, let's talk about what some people call the peace process in the Middle East. We all remember President Trump's deal, which didn't came through. We all remember President Obama's policy. It seems like America kind of lost its way regarding its policy in the Middle East.
Well, as you mentioned at the beginning, part of my reason for being in Israel is that I spoke at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center in Jerusalem on the occasion of the 30th yahrzeit of Begin, of his death in 1992. And one of the visions that Menachem Begin had was not just to focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but he envisioned a comprehensive peace in the Middle East between Israel and all the Arab countries, or as many as possible. And in fact, he was able, as a result of that, to negotiate the first peace treaty with an Arab country, which of course was with Egypt. So we tried for a long time after Oslo, all of us, to work out progress in the relations with the Palestinians, and it just didn't work. And therefore, I think over time, the obvious alternative course was to see if we could bring Israel and some of the Sunni Arab countries together. And that happened to the credit of the Trump administration. In the Abraham Accords, I think they're historic, they're progressive. And of course, part of why they were negotiated successfully is because the Gulf Arab countries and Sunni Arab countries generally and Israel share a fear of Iran. And that's why I'm so worried about what's happening in Vienna at the negotiating table now, because if America begins to seem like an unreliable ally to the Arab countries and Israel in the conflict with Iran, then it could actually jeopardize the Abraham Accords, which really the opposite should happen. It should draw Israel and the Arab countries even closer together against Iran. And that's the winning combination. And of course, I think the United States should be there right as part of that anti-Iran coalition in the Middle East.
If you add to that the rapid withdrawal from Afghanistan, it sends a very concerning message to America's allies in the region.
Well, I agree. I thought that was one of the biggest mistakes and most embarrassing acts of American foreign policy in memory, really. You have to almost go back to, maybe the exit from Vietnam. In the first place, I thought that the rhetoric being used in the United States was that America's involvement in Afghanistan was the longest war in our history. Was not true. We were not involved in the Afghan war anymore. We had only 2,500 troops in Afghanistan, opposed to 150,000 NATO troops at one point, and those 2,500 were involved in counter-terrorism in Afghanistan and in the rest of the region. So I thought it was a mistake. And incidentally, they were giving great moral support to the Afghan government and the Afghan military. So it was a mistake to pull out. And of course, the way we did it seemed so incompetent that it was a real setback for the U.S. And of course, what it did, as you said, is no secret foreign policy ever, and particularly not today, with global communications. So the net effect of the withdrawal, the retreat from Afghanistan, was to really unsettle our allies around the world, here in the Middle East, and to encourage and embolden our enemies like Iran, Russia, and China. And I just hope that President Biden is strong against Russia in the Ukrainian crisis as a way to try to regain some of the credibility that America lost after the withdrawal, the terrible withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Yes. I'll translate for a second now. אנחנו מדברים על המדיניות האמריקאית במזרח התיכון. אני אומר לו, עושה רושם שהאמריקאים קצת מבולבלים בכל מה שנוגע למדיניות שלהם במזרח התיכון. הוא אומר, אני חושב שהמדיניות האמריקאית צריכה להיות יצירת קואליציה אנטי-איראנית. הנשיא טראמפ במהלך הקריירה שלו ביחד עם הסכמי אברהם שאותם הוא ונתניהו הביאו, הצליחו לייצר חזית כזאת, אבל יש עדיין הרבה מאוד עבודה לעשות. איראן היא האיום המרכזי על היציבות ועל השלום במזרח התיכון. דיברתי איתו על הנסיגה האמריקאית מאפגניסטן ועל הטראומה שהיא יצרה אצל חלק מבעלות בריתה, ביניהן ישראל, שגרמו לה להרים גבה, והוא אומר, אכן זו הייתה נסיגה מבישה, כמו גנבים בלילה, היא פגעה באינטרסים של ארצות הברית מול בעלות בריתה, ובהחלט שידרה להם מסר מאוד מאוד בעייתי. אני חושב שזו הייתה טעות, שאנחנו עוד נדע רק בעתיד מה היקף השיעור שלה. Senator Lieberman, you're here to talk about, you visited Israel to talk about Prime Minister Begin. I would like to draw a line between Prime Minister Begin, the late Prime Minister Begin, into the current Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. Do you think that historically those figures can match, can even be put in the same sentence?
I didn't hear it totally, but you're asking about whether...
About the current Prime Minister Bennett and, his stance, if you compare him to the late Prime Minister Begin.
Yeah. Well, look, the Begin story is a remarkable story because he ended up as a figure in history much different than he was thought of earlier. I mean, he was, of course, a passionate Zionist. Incidentally, he became a Zionist along with influenced by Jabotinsky in response to the anti-Semitism that they saw in Europe, an anti-Semitism that is nothing like it was then today, but it is rising again. Important to remember. He was a patriot. He put the country first, and he compromised when he had to and got a lot done, including the peace with Egypt and some significant domestic accomplishments in Israel. So whereas at one point Menachem Begin was called a terrorist, particularly against the British, of course, before independence, he ended up being seen in history as a peacemaker. So I would say that Naftali Bennett is at the beginning of his leadership of Israel, but I think he's off to a good start. And like everyone else, I admire the broad coalition and the government, particularly with the other leaders, Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid. And the coalition seems to be holding together. They've adopted a budget. They have begun a new chapter in relations with the United States, which I'm optimistic about. They're really trying to be very bipartisan in relations with the United States. So the beginning of the story, the history of Naftali Bennett is what we're experiencing now. And whether he rises to the level of Begin is obviously up to him and history. But I would say right now I'm encouraged. And I do hope that Prime Minister Bennett and everyone else who follows him learn from the great lessons of Menachem Begin about what it means to be a leader of Israel and of the Jewish people, willing, very proud, very patriotic, very principled, and yet willing to compromise when necessary, and most of all, as in the Altalena event and of course the 67 war, willing to put the country first over his own political interests. So Begin is a remarkable figure who all of us, including American politicians, can learn a lot from.
Agreed. Senator Lieberman, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your visit in Israel. We appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Always great to be here. All the best to you, Shai. I look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. רק אתרגם את המשך דבריו, אני שואל אותו לגבי הקשר, יותר נכון הוא נמצא כאן לרגל 30 שנה לפטירת בגין, אני מבקש ממנו לייצר השוואה בין בגין לבין ראש הממשלה הנוכחי, מר בנט, שאלתי אותו אם הם עומדים באותו שיעור קומה היסטורי, הוא קודם מדבר על מר בגין שהתחיל כמי שנתפס כטרוריסט, וההיסטוריה תזכור אותו כאדם שהביא שלום, אדם ציוני, אדם שהעם היהודי ומדינת ישראל היו במקום הראשון אצלו. הוא חושב שיש זיקה בהיבט הזה גם בין בנט לבין מר בגין. הוא טוען שבנט אמנם רק בראשית הדרך, אבל הוא מצליח לייצר קואליציה שמאמין ליברמן שהאינטרסים שלה הם כמובן לטובת ישראל, אבל הוא אומר עדיין מוקדם לומר אם הוא יגדל לממדים הללו, רק בראשית המהלך ההיסטורי שהוא מבצע. זה הסנטור ג'ו ליברמן. אנחנו נצא